With Washington recalibrating its approach to Pyongyang and to Iran, questions are growing over how Seoul should navigate an increasingly uncertain geopolitical landscape. Hope your work week is off to a good start. You're watching Press Perspective for this Monday, August 24th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. As the Trump administration seeks dialogue with North Korea while pressing allies over Iran, South Korea faces a delicate balancing act between its security ties with the U.S. and its own strategic interests. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here.
And I also have Professor Park Won-gon at Ewha Womans University live on the line. Professor Park, as always, it's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thomas, let's start here in the studio. Let's begin with the response among pundits here in the country with regard to Mr. Trump's decision to downscale U.S. defense drills with South Korea for a dialogue with North Korea. What have you been hearing?
Hearing, lots of different things. There's been obviously a lot of reaction to it. I mean, probably most broadly, some version of concern, surprise, and maybe questions about, the long-term impact on U.S.-South Korea relationship. But, there's kind of different tracks as far as, which sort of pundits or what areas they're focusing on. I think from the kind of North Korea national security side of things, just generally, I think a lot of skepticism about the move as to whether North Korea will even respond by coming to the table. I think just questions about that. And then B, what kind of deal would even be on the table for Trump to make? I mean, a lot of people have talked about how just North Korea is in a very different position than they were the first time Trump, met with Kim. Their nuclear arsenal's much farther along. They're much less isolated. So, there's this sense, and there's been some concern that people have expressed that, Trump may be so eager to make some kind of a deal that he offers concessions, maybe that Seoul would not be able to take, from reducing troops or removing troops or maybe recognizing North Korea as a nuclear power. These are sort of questions that people are asking. And, I think some of the local reactions, I've seen a lot of kind of newspaper editorials, especially on the more sort of conservative leaning sides that are very alarmed by, have called this cut reckless, but have also focused on this idea of, is this, some call it Korea passing, this idea that Seoul is being sidelined by matters. So I think that's a real concern. Is Seoul going to be kind of cut out of this direct negotiation? At the same time, on someone maybe the more traditionally left or liberal side have given it a little more of a positive spin. There's talk that this could help create atmosphere for a dialogue with North Korea, and that's sort of the way the Lee Jae-myung administration has been trying to spin this as well. So there's that, and I think just more also on a kind of a pragmatic track, some analysts I've talked to, just looking at it more as this sense of, okay, this is Trump, using pressure on South Korea to go along with, he had raised the question or, his concerns that South Korea had not participated in the Iran war. And there's this feeling also that Washington is annoyed at Seoul for not moving quickly enough with this $350 billion investment pledge they made during the tariff negotiations. So, I think some also see this as, okay, this is kind of a pressure to get some things that Washington wants, some concessions from Seoul. So maybe this is, could this be more of just a short-term thing to navigate and, maybe things would move back a little bit more. One analyst I talked to was saying, a few months ago, Hegseth, Defense Secretary Hegseth, was praising South Korea as a model ally, and now we've got them, Trump is railing against them. So, there's some kind of sense of that too, of how to navigate it. But, I think just overall, clearly it feels like a bit of an inflection point, and we're seeing Washington and Trump really focusing on this region a lot more kind of than perhaps earlier in the term. So, there's a lot of discussion around it still going on.
Right, indeed. And adding on to what Thomas has said, Professor Park, some have questioned the unilateral, unexpected manner in which the decision itself was announced. How do you respond?
Well, first of all, let me just say this is unprecedented. The exercise has already begun, and then in the middle of it, it gets scaled down. I cannot think about a single case like this in the history of the alliance. So even before we talk about the substance, the way this happened is already something new. Now, when I look at the decision itself, I see the three problems. The first one is the defense commitment. People sometimes think these exercises are just routine, just soldiers running around in the field. They are not. The combined exercise is the mechanism, the core mechanism through which Korea and the United States actually operate as one system against the North Korean threat. It is how we test whether the command structure works, whether the reinforcement plan works, whether the two militaries can fight together. So when that gets cut back and cut back unilaterally by Washington, of course, people in Seoul start asking the obvious question: how solid is this American commitment to defend this country? And once that question is in the air, it does not go away easily. The second problem is the reasoning. President Trump's talk about the cost. He said that exercise was expensive. Now we had heard this kind of language from him before. Going back to his first term, he called the exercise war games and complained about the price tag. But there is a big difference between saying it and doing it. This time he actually did it. And what that tells us is that the transactional view of the alliance is no longer just rhetoric. It is now policy. And if you keep applying that logic, if every joint activity has to justify itself on a cost sheet, the alliance slowly becomes hollow. You keep the treaty, you keep the name, but you lose the substance. And the third problem is the timing and the direction. This was a one-sided friendly gesture toward Pyongyang, and what did Washington get for it? At this moment, nothing. North Korea has not said it wants to talk to the United States. There has been no positive signal from Pyongyang, no expression of willingness. So the United States gave away something valuable before the negotiation even started. In any negotiation, that weakens your own hand. You spend your leverage first, and then you sit down at the table with less to work with.
Right then, Thomas, as Professor Park has mentioned, North Korea's response to Mr. Trump's efforts at rapprochement, if you will, have been lukewarm, to say the least. In fact, let's take this opportunity to walk through North Korea's reaction.
Yeah, as you said, they've showed, very little eagerness so far, and not really straining at the leash to get to the negotiating table. We saw Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, on Wednesday had released a statement in the North Korean state-run media saying that Pyongyang had no interest in the exercise being scaled back, called it unworthy of comment. Basically she was saying it doesn't change the nature of the drills, cutting it back. They're still provocative and offensive, she said. And she said if the U.S. calculates that, this would be seen as a kind of a good faith measure, they will not get the desired answer, she said. And she also mentioned that North Korea, she had no knowledge of any communication between Trump and her brother. Trump had kind of insinuated that Kim and he had been in communication, but wasn't really clear about that. She said wasn't aware of it. Although she added that the relationship between her brother and Trump is still excellent, she said, and kind of made a distinction between their personal relationship and the overall U.S. hostile policy to North Korea, which is interesting. And then on Thursday, she actually released another commentary that was more mocking South Korea and President Lee, saying that basically South Korea was a puppet, and and it was shameful what Lee had said about sort of finding respect for Trump's order. So, and then on Thursday as well, North Korea fired more than 10 short-range ballistic missiles towards the EC, which was like the third launch in 2 weeks. So in case you needed any more clarity about how they were reacting to it, so clearly not much interest, but I think people have noticed, obviously mentioning the relationship with Trump in particular feels like it leaves the door open a bit, and especially in the sense of, separating out the Trump-Kim relationship from the overall Washington-Pyongyang thing kind of plays more into this is how Trump sees this anyway, so can we do something outside of the sort of formal structures of the relationship, as well as maybe the mockery of South Korea as kind of marginalizing them as a player as well. So, there's the sense that they haven't slammed the door perhaps on this, but the idea is, are they kind of, raising the price of engagement for something to go forward? I think that's the status, the state of things right now.
Right, and speaking about the price, Professor Park, there are analysts who believe that North Korea will no doubt seek to set certain conditions for any form of communication with the U.S. What conditions might we be looking at, and what are the prospects of the Trump administration approving those conditions?
Well, I think we actually have a fairly clear picture of what Pyongyang wants, because Kim Jong-un told us himself. Back in February at the 9th Party Congress, he said that if the United States respect North Korea's constitutional status and withdraw its hostile policy, then there is no reason the two countries cannot improve relations. So there are two conditions right there. Let me take them one at a time. Constitutional status. That means nuclear weapon state. North Korea wrote that into its constitution, but here is the detail that I think matters most. And it is easy to miss. He did not say recognized, he said respect. That is a deliberate choice of words. Recognition is a legal act, very hard, very public, almost impossible for any American administration to grant. Respect is a matter of behavior. It means treat us as a nuclear power in practice, even if you never say so on paper. And that opens a door. It suggests Pyongyang is not demanding formal recognition on day one. What it wants is the negotiation conducted between two nuclear states, which means arms control, not denuclearization. That is a real message. North Korea wants to sit down as an equal and talk about arms reduction, not about giving up its weapons. The second condition, the hostile policy, this is an old North Korean phrase. They have used it for a decade, and it's a deliberately vague. But if you read Kim Yo-jong's two recent statements, as just Thomas said, together with the Party Congress speech, the priority is clear. The core demand is a permanent end to the combined exercise. The list also includes the withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Korea. But that is the long-term item. The immediate one is the exercise. And I would put it in this way. Stopping the exercise is not a sufficient condition for U.S.-North Korean talks, but it is somewhere between a necessary condition and precondition. Now, how likely is Washington to accept? I would say it is already partly accepting. The UFS exercise was scaled down. A full suspension going forward is a real possibility. And on the nuclear question, when reporter asked President Trump about denuclearization, he did not answer. The White House is talking about without condition, precondition, which by definition does not put denuclearization on the table as the entry requirement. So the American position is already moving in Pyongyang's direction.
Right, and against this backdrop, Thomas, there are observers who claim that Mr. Trump's sudden shift to North Korea is an attempt of trying to move the domestic narrative away from Iran and inflation in the U.S. economy. What can you share?
Yeah, I mean, it may be, I think as far as what kind of impact it's going to have in terms of moving the narrative, I would say minimal or no impact, as far as, addressing the sort of source of trouble, low approval ratings from Iran and inflation. I mean, I don't think North Korea is on most Americans' radar at all at this point. I don't think it's in the top 30 things that people are really concerned about when they talk about, presidential approval rating. I mean, Trump is always good at controlling news cycles. I mean, we'll all cover it. It'll take, it'll get headlines, but I don't think it really moves the needle as far as, taking away attention from the things that are not going well or that are, people are unhappy about. And those are just these underlying factors that are, high prices, food prices are high, gas prices are high, and people are connecting it to this war in Iran that has led to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and, the tariffs. So people are sort of making those connections, and people are, concerned, about healthcare issues like that. There's just big uneasiness about the state of the economy. All of these factors you can't really distract people away from. So, I think there is a little bit of a growing sense too among the populace that, this administration is not focusing on the issues that are really that compelling to them. And so in a sense, maybe this North Korea story could also be seen as a kind of a distraction in the sense of why are you not focusing on these more directly impacting, these factors that really affect us. And I think, even this time around, the framing of it is so kind of hard to get a sense of what he's going after, in the sense that, he keeps praising Kim Jong-un and praises the relationship that they have. It's not, he's not really making it sound like Kim Jong-un is the threat. It's more that South Korea is creating these, this hostile situation. So, he's much harsher on South Korea than North Korea. So it's a sense of, what is, why is this important then? I mean, at least when the first time around, there was a sense of alarm around North Korea. They had, in 2017, they had conducted a nuclear test, and they launched, these ICBMs for the first time. I think it was the Hwasong-14. So there was, I think it really was on people's radars in the U.S. at that point, like, oh, they may actually be able to reach us, with a nuclear weapon. So there was some sense of, oh, this is, and there was a little more of a painting of Kim Jong-un as unreliable or a madman or something. There was that framing. Now he's like Trump's buddy, they respect each other, and Trump even said, he's got all these nuclear weapons, but it's not really a problem as long as I'm the one kind of in charge, it's okay, so I guess I would say if you're selling it as this was an important thing to do for the American public, it's not really clear as to why that's that important, and I don't think it's going to take people's minds off of their day-to-day concerns in any significant way.
Right then. Professor Park, with regard to Iran, the U.S., it's pressing American allies to place their weight behind an unprecedented economic isolation campaign against Iran. Now, this particular thing follows Trump's earlier allegation of the administration's lack of support for his war against Iran. How does the Trump administration's economic war against Iran look to affect South Korea's foreign policy, do you think?
Well, every American ally is having a hard time with this, but I would argue South Korea is in particularly difficult position, harder than most. And here is why. Look at what happened around the exercise decision. When President Trump scaled down the drills, he also criticized South Korea for not contributing in Strait of Hormuz. Those two things came together. And once you put them side by side, you realize that one of the reasons for cutting the exercise was the Seoul's lack of contribution to the Iran campaign. So follow the logic as he sees it. South Korea did not help in a war the United States is fighting. Therefore, why should the United States defend South Korea? Therefore, we scale back the exercise. That is the sequence. Contribution, commitment, and now the alliance itself are all kind of together in one chain. And that is a very uncomfortable position for Seoul, because it means that Iran issue is no longer a Middle Eastern question. It has become a Korean Peninsula security question, which means South Korea is now in a position where it more or less has joined the expanded economic blockade of Iran, not because Seoul wants to, but because the cost of not doing is, it is now being charged directly to the alliance account. And this is real difficulty. South Korea has spent years trying not to burn that bridge. Even though the worst period, Seoul kept its embassy open in Tehran, Seoul has always tried to keep a channel open quietly, precisely to manage those risks. Now that balancing act is basically over, Korea is being asked to choose publicly, and the choice is not really a choice. So what should the government do? I would say to accept that Seoul is going to have to move toward Washington on this, but negotiate the terms rather than simply complying.
And staying with the same issue, Thomas, very briefly speaking, what has been the response from other U.S. allies with regard to this unprecedented economic isolation campaign against Iran?
I mean, there hasn't been much in terms of a concrete response, and in some ways, we're still waiting for more details to come out about what this plan is going to mean. I mean, the United Arab Emirates had said Wednesday it was suspending all trade and financial dealings with Iran, but that was kind of after a incoming missile threat. It was a little ahead of the announcement, but there's some sense that Washington sort of pushed them in that direction. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's just kind of allies are waiting to see what their options are going to be. I mean, India is a big part. Some of the major partners or financial partners of Iran are also not really under this umbrella anyway. We're talking China and Russia. I mean, China basically just called for diplomacy and dialogue, sort of pushed against the idea of sanctions. India has sort of called for diplomacy and dialogue. You know, Egypt, I saw, wants to return to diplomatic path. So I don't think there's a real eagerness among most of the allies to get into this kind of economic warfare situation, but I think they're going to have to wait and see, you know, what kind of leverage Washington is going to try to push against them, as Professor Park mentioned with South Korea.
Right, indeed. As you mentioned, details of that particular campaign will be disclosed later on this Monday. Professor Park, in the meantime, given the latest developments on the geopolitical front, how should South Korea seek to maintain relevance and not be sidelined, as Thomas mentioned earlier?
Well, let me start with honest assessment, which is not a comfortable one. I do think U.S.-North Korea meeting can happen. I would not call it certain, but it is a real possibility. And the problem for Seoul is that South Korea could be left out of it entirely. And notice that Korea is being squeezed from both sides at once. From the American side, the exercise decision tells you everything. It was made and announced without meaningful coordination, and this is not just about Korea. The administration does not show much regard for allies and partners in general when it decides something, when it decides something. So Seoul cannot assume it will be consulted, and it certainly cannot assume it will be in the room. From the North Korean side, Pyongyang has been shutting South Korea out deliberately since December 2023, when Kim Jong-un declared two hostile state lines and called South Korea a belligerent state. That was a strategic decision, and they've been consistent about it. The whole point of that doctrine is to remove Seoul from the occasion and deal only with Washington. So North Korea has no interest in giving South Korea a seat. Squeeze from both directions, that is genuinely difficult place to be. So what do you do about it? My view is that the answer is not to chase Pyongyang. It is to fix Washington relationship first, because right now that is the only channel that actually works. Three things concretely. First, the Iran contribution. Second, finalize the investment package with the United States and do it quickly. Third, rebuild the working channel on North Korean policy. So my prescription is straightforward. Stop trying to get into U.S.-North Korean room and instead make sure Seoul is indispensable to Washington before that room opens.
Right, indeed. And those are the thoughts of Professor Park Won-gon at Ewha Womans University. Professor Park, as always, thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
And Thomas here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Right then, with tensions rising on multiple fronts, how Seoul's response could shape its place in a rapidly changing regional and global order. That's all today. Thank you for watching.